Hello and welcome everybody to Joey's Spotlight, where we have people from all different backgrounds and professions who join us to discuss all sorts of interesting things about the world of animal advocacy. My name is Colleen and I'm one of your hosts for this evening, and I'm also accompanied by Mr. Scott Fine, the founder of Joey's Legacy. Scott, how are you doing?
Hi, Colleen. How are you doing?
Doing well, doing
Doing
well. How
good.
are you?
Okay, good. Well, we have a very special guest tonight, and I'm very honored to have him on board with us. He's a former professional race car driver and a responsible breeder of American Bulldogs for over 20 years, he and his wife, actually. And I'd like to introduce everyone to Mr. Igor Sushko. Igor, welcome. Thank you for taking time to join us.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Scott.
Yep.
I was very surprised to find your organization just
Many
by
are.
chance online. And
Yep.
it's really the exposure you're trying to provide to this systemic issue
Yes.
of
Absolutely.
veterinary malpractice is absolutely invaluable. And it's so important, and it's your work is really filling that vacuum that unfortunately exists in the United States veterinary care specifically.
Thank you. We feel like we've accomplished a lot in the last 4 years, and got a long way to go. And you and I had a conversation a few weeks ago, and I was extremely impressed with your level of knowledge in the area of veterinary malpractice and animal advocacy in general. And I'm basically just going to let you start the conversation flowing. And if anyone, whoever's out there, I would strongly urge that you grab a notepad with a pen, because it's highly likely you're going to learn some things tonight that you've not heard before, based on Igor's experience with malpractice and as a responsible breeder. So Igor, take it away.
Sure. So I think I want to start with providing a little bit of a background about us. So my wife Olga and I, she's the brains behind this operation here. I married into it.
Okay.
But she's been breeding American Bulldogs since 2000, so for 22 years now. And the unique perspective and insights really come from the fact that she's Russian. So she was born and grew up in Russia, and she began breeding there before moving here to the United States back in 2014. And so there were so many things, essentially almost every aspect when it comes to dog ownership and care, that really just stunned her and shocked her based on all of her prior experience around the world, especially because she has owners, hundreds and hundreds of owners that are all over the world. So she has a lot of insight and understanding into how veterinary care is practiced in different countries, in different regions of the world, what the differences are in dog food, even when it comes to some things like the genetic quality of the dog itself. And her conclusion really very, very quickly was that the veterinary care in the United States is by far the most expensive in the world, and also absolutely the worst. Unfortunately, the typical pet owner in America is disadvantaged in almost every aspect with regards to dog ownership because of the systemic issues that exist, many of which are pretty specific to the US. Some of these issues are shared with a few other countries, but they also turn out to be largely English speaking, like Canada and the United Kingdom, for example. I think what we should start with is probably covering the typical experience that a pet owner might have with regards to, starting with a puppy, right? You may get a puppy, and then you are going through several vaccinations like booster shots. Then you would get a rabies vaccine, typically at 4 months old. Then you might go through a spay or a neuter, which is extremely common in the US, anywhere from 6 months old, even upwards of 2 years old, maybe. And it's probably pretty common, at least from what we hear and experiences that owners share with us with their previous dogs. Antibiotic use, steroid use is very rampant for some of the really things that are not going to be requiring that kind of serious medication for the most part. And so other things that we commonly hear about is allergies, right? So dogs have allergies, recurring infections, things like canine cruciate ligament ruptures, the anatomical injuries really that are, in the case of a CCL, that's a degenerative thing, hip dysplasia. Some of those anatomical things very largely genetic and hereditary, but a dog that might have a genetic predisposition for it, with the way that vet care is practiced here, they're almost guaranteed to actually have that expressed phenotypically in terms of acquiring that disease, even though with a different environmental care that may not have happened. So maybe we can start even with boosters or just vaccinations, including rabies, right? So I'll lay down a little bit of groundwork and then I'll explain how that ties into malpractice that's very common. So maybe, an owner would wonder, like, why do you go through an iteration of these boosters in a young puppy? So you would do it at 8 weeks old, 10 weeks old, 12 weeks old, right? Every couple of weeks, usually about 3 times. Some vets even want to keep going for more. We definitely would never recommend going beyond 3 boosters. The reason that a puppy is given those booster vaccinations in succession like that at that kind of a young age, for things like parvo, distemper, right? Deadly diseases, potentially, is because when the puppy is nursing on mom's milk and they are actually getting the antibodies for those diseases through the milk from the mom. And so what the risk you're running into if you were to just vaccinate, say, at 8 weeks old and be done with it in case of those kind of boosters, is that the mom's milk that the puppy ingested contains those antibodies. And so when that virus or the DNA of that virus is introduced through the vaccine into the body of the puppy, mom's antibodies that still have actually remained in the organism just go and neutralize that virus. And so there's no immune response from the puppy's own organism, from the puppy's own immune system to that vaccination. And so then it's like a blank shot to where your puppy is not protected. And so it is done in succession over a few weeks at a time so that there are no gaps in protection in case the antibodies have left the body a little earlier or later. Because, I mean, some moms, they don't want to feed their puppies anymore at 4 weeks old, while there are other moms, they want to keep doing it at 8, 9 weeks old, right? So there's a huge variance there. And so these processes sort of normalize without knowing the facts of the specific individual puppy. The timing of these vaccinations is something that is very much often overlooked by most veterinarians in America, from what we see, because we have owners all over the country. We have to cover sort of the basics of the immune system development of a canine organism when they are about 3.5 months old. In the case, at least, of American Bulldogs, I can't imagine it being too different with any other breed. They, like clockwork, they start losing their baby teeth, and they begin to, their adult teeth begin to grow in through their gums. Just like that kind of teething can adversely affect a human baby and the baby's immune system. They could be crying, they could be feeling a little bit of a pain, running a fever. That can adversely affect the immune system of the organism so that the vaccinations that are administered after that period, they can significantly cause various side effects on the puppy. So on a timeline, the teeth start falling out about 3.5 months old. There's some individual difference between the dogs, but what we see usually is the puppy stops teething completely, so their teeth are no longer moving, the rear molars, the biggest teeth, 15 to 18 months old. The prime period, the period where it's the most rapid effect on the puppy's own immune system, is about 4 months old, actually, when those teeth are really coming in. And so the potential side effects that exist from administering a rabies vaccine, which is commonly done at 4 months old in the US, one is that the immune system is just doesn't have the bandwidth, doesn't have the capacity to develop enough antibodies against the vaccine and the rabies virus, because it's so potentially suppressed from the loss and the new teeth growing in during that 4 month of age. Another potential side effect is the immune system does want to develop those antibodies, and it goes a little bit into overdrive while it's dealing with the teething, so that then we have a situation where the organism becomes a lot more susceptible to other pathogens in the environment, whether it be, parvo or fungal infections, other viral infections, bacterial infections, and even potentially allergic reactions. So allergies at the core are an autoimmune disease. And the problem is that the immune system is responding to something that is harmless as if it's a pathogen. That is what allergies are. And when the immune system gets sort of messed around with in a developing puppy that doesn't have a mature immune system to begin with different medications or these vaccinations, when the puppy's immune system might be the most vulnerable, it can get a little tweaky to where the immune system can get confused. And I want to start providing sort of concrete examples of the things that we've observed over all these years. In terms of the kind of owners that we have, medical professionals, doctors, vets, nurses, pharmaceutical industry professionals, really overrepresented as far as our owners go. But with regards to that vaccination timing possibly actually exhibiting that situation that I talked about, we don't have dogs that have allergies. But there was an instance some years back when an owner called me and told me that their puppy was almost 5 months old, like 4 months and 3 weeks old or so at the time, all of a sudden developed an allergy to their own grass. And whenever there's an issue that arises with our owners' dogs, we want to start with a timeline and understand what preceded that. And that is when I found out that the puppy was actually vaccinated for rabies at 4 months old, even though our recommendation to our owners is always to do it specifically at 3 months old, before the teething begins. And we try to manage that situation just with topical ointments, right? So that the puppy is more comfortable. Ask the owners to make sure that they just wash their dog whenever the puppy is on the grass before going back home, so that those irritants are off their body as much as possible. And given that it's a developing immune system, we expect it to hopefully resolve on its own, so that once the immune system stabilizes a little more. And sure enough, a month later, the allergy for grass was completely gone. But imagine taking that kind of dog to a vet, right? what they will most likely do in the US is start administering steroids and antibiotics. The important thing about steroids is that it is a very potent immunosuppressant. So it's sort of a miracle drug in a way, because it will suppress any kind of inflammation in the organism within minutes. And in other countries, steroids, of course, it's a class of drugs. They have a place in medicine, but it is treated completely differently compared to the United States. So a very easy example, I think, to digest where steroid use would be most likely appropriate for a dog is, say that your dog was stung by some kind of a bug around the face or neck area, and now the dog's trachea is closing and the dog is beginning to suffocate. So it can't breathe because of that inflammation and that reaction to that sting. That is a life or death situation. And of course, a steroid is something that might be the only thing that could potentially save the life of that dog. And so you're playing that trade-off to where you're saving the life of the dog, but you're going to be potentially living with very, very significant consequences to the health of the dog that could even be potentially permanent from that use of steroid. Any single administration of a steroid into the organism can potentially adversely affect the immune system function on a permanent basis. That is how potent it is. So every time the steroid is administered, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will change the immune system function forever, but there's that chance, depending on the individual dog and many other factors. And so it is something that has to be handled and used very, very carefully. And of course, when it comes to what we see here, it's the first thing oftentimes that the vets go to. And it's as if the approach, the philosophy in vet care here in the US is one of just minimize or eliminate whatever the symptoms are and send the owner home without even trying to address the underlying issue. An interesting example. So we used to live on the coast in Los Angeles, and we had a puppy at the time. She was about 3-4 months old, and we were already teaching her swimming, and she was swimming in the ocean. But as a result of that, she developed a little bit of inflammation in her ear. So a little red. It wasn't anything critical. Took her to a local vet. And this veterinarian has all these kind of, framed certificates and awards and everything. She's the practice owner herself. She looks at the dog, and even without asking us for consent or anything, already prepares a syringe ready to inject something into the puppy. And I asked her, what are you trying to inject? Is this a hormone? And she said, no, it's a steroid. It's just a little bit of dumbfounding when you encounter that kind of situation, because obviously a steroid is a hormone. And to think that a veterinarian doesn't understand that,
Right.
It is just absolutely dumbfounding.
Sure.
And another illustrative example would be a puppy that was at the time 6 months old, and she had developed a little bit of inflammation. And again, this is happening during this period where the immune system is developing. Sometimes puppies will on their own just not have enough immune response to protect themselves from these opportunistic pathogens, right? So for example, when you're talking about a staph bacterial infection on the skin, staph bacteria exists on everybody's skin at all times. It's something that all animals live with. It only becomes an infection when an immune system of the organism is unable to actually keep the bacteria at bay. So it doesn't allow it to colonize. Same with any kind of fungal infection, really. Yeast is also a type of fungus. And so these things are in our environment at all times. And so this puppy developed on the rear hocks a little bit of inflammation, redness, loss of fur. And, but she wasn't bothered by it. And we had just recently moved here to Nevada, and we just decided to go take her to a local vet to see what the local vet might be like. And the vet enters the exam room, eyeballs this 6-month-old puppy, and says, "This is allergies," without running any kind of diagnostic tests. And then she actually leaves the room, comes back with a bottle of this medication called Apoquel. And my wife and I, we were completely unfamiliar with this medication. And so I immediately look up what it is on my phone. And I am reading it from the manufacturer's website. And it turns out to be, again, a very potent immunosuppressant that is prescribed to dogs typically for life, forever, daily, to alleviate symptoms of severe allergies. This medication, as I'm reading it, it says cannot be administered to dogs under 12 months of age. And I think that is, you know, there at least some understanding by the manufacturer there that you cannot be trying to suppress an immune system that hasn't even developed yet. So at least they are trying to prevent vets from giving it to young puppies. And so when I bring it up to the vet in real time, she responded with something like, "Oh, I thought it was 8 months old," which doesn't even make any sense because this puppy is 6 months old, and I made sure she knew of it before any Apoquel discussions took place. And whether she meant that you could administer it 8 months old, or whether she meant that she thought the puppy was 8 months old, it's just total gibberish, right? And so my wife understandably gets quite fed up at this point, and she begins to give specific instructions to this veterinarian of what to do in terms of diagnostics, which in this instance was simply, you know, we need to get those skin scrapings of those problem areas and send it off to a lab and receive an analysis of what kind of infection is present. And so, like, we had to point fingers and tell her, this is where you're going to be taking the sample, right? This is how you take the sample. And then told her specifically what kind of testing we wanted to have done at the lab. And she collects the information. She collects the sample, leaves the room, and then comes back again with a bottle of antibiotics. I can't remember what kind of antibiotics were. If I were to guess, probably something like Clavamox, right? That's the most typical. And I have to explain to the vet again, like, we don't know what this is. We don't know if there's a bacterial infection there. So we're not going to give this small puppy antibiotics at this time. We need to wait for the results. And so we didn't accept any medication from the vet. We go home. And then 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from her. And she tells me that the test results came back as positive for ringworm. Ringworm, contrary to its name, it's a fungal infection, right? It's athlete's foot, jock itch, something that people also get. It's a pretty common fungal infection. It also exists in dogs. And of course, the way to cure a ringworm infection has nothing to do with Apoquel, suppressing the immune system, or antibiotics. And so an interesting, I think, thought experiment to have here, and just to conclude, right, like we, received medication for that was antifungal, also did what's called a Lyme dip lime sulfur dip, and her fungal ringworm infection completely disappeared within a matter of weeks. If it was a regular pet owner in our position that came into the veterinarian like this with the same issue, first off, I think, culturally, we're very conditioned to blindly trust and rely on professionals,
Right.
especially doctors.
Yes.
And if that were allowed to have happened in this scenario, and that this puppy was put on Apoquel and antibiotics with an undiagnosed ringworm infection, first, I had this suspicion, like later down, much later when I was thinking about this situation, and I have confirmed it now with multiple vets that I'm actually friends with. My suspicion was that even though Apoquel is a allergy medication, because of the way that it seems to work in suppressing the immune system, I began to think that it was probably going to be effective at suppressing inflammation, regardless of the cause of inflammation, like a steroid. And my friends that are veterinarians, actually, when they started thinking about it, when I asked them about it, and they looked up the information on how Apoquel works, they came to the same conclusion, that it's very likely that Apoquel would suppress any kind of inflammation, even if it is a result of an infection rather than an allergy. Because the immune system process there is basically identical, right? The immune system is confusing a non-infection for an infection. It's the same inflammation that results from it as an immune response. And so with Apoquel in the body, that inflammation on the puppy would have likely subsided significantly, very rapidly. Then you put on top of that antibiotics. One of the most common and pretty bad side effects of antibiotic use is fungal infections. I think especially women would know about this, right? Like yeast infections that can arise from just having a course of antibiotics. Oftentimes, actually, in other countries, there's certain practices where if you are having to administer, and this is human medicine, if you're having to administer an antibiotic for a pretty extended period of time, it's matched with the least damaging type of antifungal medication as well to prevent that from happening to begin with as a prophylaxis. So this poor puppy in that situation on antibiotics and Apoquel you would have seen the symptoms subside significantly. So you're going to think, wow, this medication is working. This vet is right. This was allergies. While the fungal infection would have continued to grow much more rapidly because the puppy now has an immune system that is suppressed by Apoquel. And also, of course, antibiotics also suppress the immune system. So once you put a dog in that kind of situation, I don't know what would have happened to her. Like she would have imploded at some point after it would have come back, but probably 10 times worse. And then it could have been systemic instead of just a localized infection. So those kind of things, if you think about it, the issue is a total absence of following the cornerstone of medicine, which is the diagnostic method. So in order to actually address any kind of a health problem, the veterinarian must first run diagnostics without guesswork to identify what the problem is. If it's an infection, what kind of an infection it is. Something that is a very common refrain that we ourselves have heard from vets, but also same thing with, I think is going to strike true with many listeners. Here, take this. If it doesn't work, come back in a few days, right? That is one of the biggest red flags you can think of. when it comes to trying to find a normal vet. So
Right.
The problems that are often encountered by owners over the life of the dog, I think quite a few of them, they actually stem from that blind trust and reliance on the veterinarian that starts from puppyhood, where seemingly correct and even harmless things are actually what's causing the constant deterioration of the immune system function of a puppy before the puppy even had a chance to develop. And so, because any kind of health issue you can think of in an animal, it all goes back to the strength and sort of the balance of the immune system function. And so if you were, as an owner, to really focus on protecting and nurturing that immune system while the dog is still a puppy, and the dog has managed to enter adulthood with an intact, unblemished immune system, you have a much higher chance of having a very long, healthy life for that dog. Let's see here. So when it comes to allergies, and this is, again, it comes from a sort of a unique perspective that we have, and especially my wife, having done this around the world, dog food allergies are, in almost all instances, a made-up thing, as crazy as that sounds. And there are even dermatologist specialists that are highly experienced in the U.S. that have told their owners, we've heard of these conversations, that it doesn't happen. One of the common things you hear is, my dog is allergic to chicken. My dog is allergic to beef in the dog food. Canines at the core are essentially almost completely carnivores. It's their basic diet, meat. So for an organism to have an allergic reaction to what they're supposed to be eating to survive is something that really doesn't pass, the muster of logic even. Granted, once you do have a puppy that has been abused, whose immune system has been abused like that, with vaccinating between 3 and 6 months old, when it's the most critical development period for the immune system, administering things like Apoquel or steroids or antibiotics unnecessarily, right? Then the immune system could go haywire, and I guess it's conceivable that now the dog is allergic to its own meat that it needs to eat, but it's still highly unlikely. Usually it's just misdiagnosed when there's an actual underlying issue that's completely different. Like, we have experienced ourselves in that instance where it turned out to be a ringworm and not allergies. And so you have to be really careful with that. And also, there aren't really dog allergies in other countries like they do exist in America, which again should be immediately a giveaway that something is going on here that is different. And so it's definitely true that dogs can have reactions to various types of dog foods. And it is, again, almost uniquely an American problem. I think the reason for that is that the dog's immune system, right, the entire organism, it's not reacting as an allergy. It's actually reacting to potential toxicity that it has to get out of its system that is in the dog food. So something that is illustrative of that point is the dog food industry is essentially unregulated in America. There is, I believe, federal regulation for dog food that regulates the size and the font that is used on the package label. But there are no regulations in terms of the process of manufacturing, the kind of ingredients that can be used, anything that has to do with the actual quality of the food. So American dog food manufacturers, they are not allowed to sell American-made dog food into the European Union. You can get Royal Canin, Hills, other American brands in Europe. In order for these companies to have been able to do that, they've actually had to build factories in the European Union that comply with the very strict regulations that exist there. The label, the packaging, the labeling all looks very similar, right? Royal Canin here, Royal Canin there. But the kibble, slightly different look and feel to it. And it's something that was a huge shock to my wife when she initially brought a couple of her puppies that she had produced from Russia back in 2015 here in the US to continue her hobby of breeding dogs. We went through dozens and dozens of dog foods in order to try to find just one that she deemed to be acceptable. And there are a lot of significant telltale signs of something being inadequate in a given dog food when it comes to a kibble. So a dog must always have consistently solid stool. So if you're noticing that the dog happens to have randomly loose stools, then there's a pretty good chance that it could be a result of the food. Farting in dogs, it's actually a pretty significant symptom that is directly associated with dog food usually, because it means that the dog is unable to properly digest and metabolize the food that it's eating. Often you see dogs that have brown stains, right? The discharge coming off from their eyes in the wrinkles, especially more bully type of dogs, or that kind of brown staining on their bellies or all over their body between their paws. That is yeast. And dog food is a very common culprit for causing that. So when poor quality ingredients are used, and it's like these kind of the carbs, which are sugars, are ingested by a dog, then that helps dramatically increase the growth of yeast, because yeast will thrive on sugar. And of course, right, none of these things are independent of each other, because when you're starting with a puppy whose immune system may have been potentially suppressed while it was still developing by different things that the vet may have done incorrectly, then you're adding on top of that poor quality dog food, right? It all comes together and sort of, the issues mount on top of each other, and it all goes back to further compromising the immune system function of the dog. And with regards to the immune system, I want to sort of stick to it for now, because it is something that I think is really unappreciated by owners, but also vets, which is very puzzling. Most vets, from our experience here, we have so many owners all over the US covering, the entire span of things. We don't have an owner in Alaska right now, but from Hawaii to New York to Florida, anywhere in between, we expect that the veterinarian that our owner is going to be using is going to be committing malpractice. And so we have to prepare every owner we have for that situation. And the way that we do it is we actually ask our owners to give us a call before going to the vet for any reason, so that I can actually prepare them for that visit, explain to them what the specific red flags may be to look out for, given the purpose of that visit. And unfortunately, it includes completely routine visits, starting with things like, the initial exam, vaccinations, receiving deworming medications or flea and tick medications. I recall in some time ago, so there was an owner in Arizona, and he took his puppy in for a rabies vaccine at 3 months old, like we always instruct our owners. And the reason you do it at 3 months is because they are still, all their baby teeth are still intact, and you have enough time there for the immune system to respond to the rabies vaccine before the immune system could be potentially suppressed from the teeth falling out and new teeth growing in. So we bypass the danger period. And so in that instance, the vet thankfully did agree to vaccinate a puppy at 3 months old, which is another story I'll get to next, but physically handed the owner deworming medication and flea and tick medication, probably something like NexGard, Simparica, right? Systemic oral, very potent stuff. If you think about it, Bravecto, as an example, it's a flea and tick medication that is effective for 3 months. So the half-life of these medications is so long. It stays in your system for 3 months to the point where it's effective. It's probably going to be there for another year from that original administration, right? So there's a lot of things to consider from that kind of perspective. You want to minimize the stress on the organism, especially in a developing puppy. And one of those things is not bunching everything together, which is what the vet suggested this owner to do. Puppy administered the vaccine, the rabies vaccine that day. The owner is receiving flea and tick medication and deworming medication, and the veterinarian tells the owner when he gets home to give both those things to the puppy that same day, right? I mean, it's possible maybe nothing will happen. But again, every visit like that is going to incrementally cause some kind of damage to the organism. So what we always tell our owners as protocol is you actually need to vaccinate a puppy, you need to deworm a puppy 7 to 10 days prior to vaccination. And the reason for that is that we always go with the assumption that the puppy has parasites, right? And most of the time, it's very, very common that puppies will, even if they're not exhibiting any symptoms, they will be sniffing, dirt, grass, they're outside. Those parasites are everywhere, and they enter the organism. So always assume that your puppy has parasites as a baseline. And so you have to deworm the puppy on a regular schedule. And at 7 to 10 days prior to a vaccination, you just deworm the puppy. So then you know that at time of vaccination, the puppy is not going to have parasites. The reason for that is, just like other infections, parasites can and will suppress the immune system. And you cannot, if you read on any warnings for vaccine manufacturers' websites about administration of them, they all state it cannot be administered to a sick dog. A puppy that has parasites is a sick dog, right? But those things are ignored for the most part by most veterinarians. And when it comes to having to use, if you live in an area in the country where you do need to use flea and tick. So for example, here in Las Vegas, we don't really have fleas or ticks, thankfully. But if you need to, you want to space out those kind of regular scheduled medications as far away from each other as you can. So you want to deworm the puppy monthly. If you're giving the puppy something like NexGard or Simparica that's monthly, offset it 2 weeks apart, right? So that you're giving your puppy's organism as much a break as possible between ingestion of all these different systemic chemicals that will remain in the body. With regards to the timing of vaccination, specifically for rabies, it's important to understand that in our experience, the rest of the civilized world vaccinates for rabies at 12 weeks old. 12 weeks, 3 months old. It's almost the same, off by a few days. That is the period that is the best time to vaccinate a puppy for rabies. Going back to the teething issue that shortly will come into play several weeks, a few weeks after they're 3 months old. In the US, most vets, as we've experienced with our owners, want to vaccinate at 4 months, which is, in our view, probably the most dangerous period to vaccinate a puppy for rabies because of potential side effects, as discussed before. But beyond that, what's really scary is we've had so many instances now around the country. First time it happened was Florida. Our owner took their 3-month-old puppy to a vet for rabies, and the vet told the owner that it is illegal. It is against Florida state law to vaccinate a dog for rabies at 3 months old. And so the owner calls me basically as he's leaving the vet because the vet refused to vaccinate. And I'm not sure, this is the first time that I encountered it. This was pretty early on when we became active here in the US. And I look up the Florida law, the statute for rabies. And the Florida law is actually very categorical, no ambiguity. All dogs must be vaccinated against rabies at 3 months old. That's what the actual law states. So now you have a veterinarian that is giving incorrect legal advice to an owner that is also potentially going to be causing, consequences to the immune system function of the puppy too. And so once that happened, that was one of the first dogs actually we sold here in the US, then it became a very common thing. Same exact story, same exact refrain and language being used by another vet in Arizona, California, Colorado, Utah. And every time I looked at the statute for that state law, these vets are all wrong. We had some vets said that it's not illegal, but it's actually not authorized by the manufacturer. So it's administration of a rabies vaccine at 3 months old. It's not approved by the manufacturer of the vaccine. You look at every single rabies vaccine that's available in the US, they're all approved for use starting at not even 3 months old, 12 weeks old. Every single one, without exception. And so I'm sure we'll talk about some of these red flags to consider when trying to find just a normal vet. Nobody's asking for a spectacular vet, although of course that would be fantastic, but just like a vet that is less likely to commit malpractice on your dog. These are the kind of red flags, right? As we're having this conversation, that you can keep in mind and watch out for, right? If you are calling a vet and asking them, can you administer a vaccine on my puppy for rabies at 3 months old? And they say, no, that's illegal, or it's wrong, or what have you, filter it out, right? Move on to the next vet. You don't need to waste any more time, because it just exhibits such a fundamental lack of understanding of the immune system function of the dog, how it develops, laws, regulations, what the manufacturers actually state about the vaccine that they're using on dogs. So there are so many red flags that are very easy to spot that, unfortunately, there are some owners where it was not even possible. If they live in an area where there are not that many vets, I would call up every one of them and I would struggle to find a single vet that I would have any kind of confidence in just potentially being normal, because you would keep hearing the same kind of stuff from them. With regards to vaccine use, that I think really surprised Scott in the initial call that we had, and there are a couple of stories that, it's sort of a similar thing that's happened. Um, this happened a few years back. We had a person getting a puppy from us in Hawaii. And so Hawaii is considered a rabies-free region. So it's treated as if it's an independent country, separate from the continental US with regards to rabies regulations. Other rabies-free regions are like Japan, Australia, maybe Israel. So it's where essentially rabies is non-existent. And so in order to import a dog into Hawaii from the mainland US, you actually have to administer 2 rabies vaccinations and also do a blood titer test. So a rabies blood titer test, the blood is drawn, it's sent off to a federally regulated lab. Usually it's going to be a university laboratory that will then issue a certificate that the given dog has enough antibodies that it has protection against rabies. So that must be done before the dog can actually go to Hawaii. And so we had administered a rabies vaccine on a puppy at 3 months old. And then a month later, so there's a waiting period before you can do the blood titer test. We did the titer test, and it came back as the antibodies concentration being too low. And in all these years, my wife has never had this happen to a single puppy, even though she's sent puppies to rabies-free regions like this before all over the world. And she immediately said this was either an expired vaccine or an improperly stored vaccine. So what's important to understand as background is an improperly stored vaccine could be a vaccine that was left out on the table, for example, at the vet's office, or during transportation, it wasn't cold. It has to be at refrigerator temperature at all times. You can't freeze it either, right? So the vaccine will be spoiled if you freeze it, or if it's left, if it gets exposed to temperature above refrigeration temperature, like room temperature. And so I look at the rabies certificate that the veterinarian had issued for the puppy, and I see that there's a lot number, but there's no expiration date for the vaccine itself, right? So if you can, no matter where you might be in the US, if you look up at and this is usually regulated at the state level, if you look at state regulations, a rabies certificate, which is actually the only vaccine that is mandated by law to be administered by a licensed veterinarian, right? All the other vaccinations like parvo, distemper, it's optional. Obviously, we absolutely think every dog should have that stuff, but you can literally do it at home yourself. So the rabies vaccine that was administered to the puppy, the certificate lists a lot number, but no expiration date. But the state law here in Nevada, as is the same in every other state, mandates that the expiration date of the actual vaccine vial, right, the actual vaccine itself, also be included on that rabies certificate. So I found that a little odd, and something, as an owner, you don't really pay attention to. You just get a rabies certificate, and and you put it away. So I thought, well, it's probably, there's probably something wrong with the vaccine, but if it's expired, they would have probably just falsified the lot number. Surely they would have lot numbers that are not expired at their practice. But to make sure, without much hope, I did call the manufacturer, and I provided them with a lot number and asked them what the expiration date was for that lot number. And then I received a letter back from them, signed. It took a couple of weeks because they actually had to get the supervisor to look up this information, like from their factory. And the letter stated the expiration date for this given lot number, and it turned out to be around a year expired. So then, because we had multiple dogs vaccinated at this facility, I looked through other certificates that we've had And each one from this place, covering, I think it was either 4 or 5 dogs over a span of a year and a half, had the same expired lot number administered. Anywhere from a couple months expired to a year and a half expired. And, you know, it doesn't, the issue here, right, it's not just that our dogs were administered what appears to be expired vaccines. This is a very big facility. It's an animal hospital with like a dozen vets. It's one of the largest here in the area, and they used to have these days, like twice a week, where it would be discounted rabies vaccinations and other vaccinations that people can come in for. And every time on such an occasion, there will be dozens of people that would be waiting to get vaccinated. So the turnover of the number of vaccines that we're administering here in Nevada was very, very significant. Like if you were just to try to estimate just over a span of at least a year and a half, when these expired lots were used, it's thousands and thousands of dogs. I'm not sure if it's going to reach 5 digits, but definitely middle 4 digits for sure. 5,000, 6,000 easy. And I began to think, like, how could that be? Because we have original signatures of all these different vets too on these certificates. And you know, when it becomes a big facility, especially, everything is, you know, sort of the roles. Everybody has a role, right? And so I know for some of those vaccinations, it was just a regular visit, not one of those vaccine days. So, I think maybe there was 1 or 2 that were actually during the vaccine day. So that wasn't a factor. They were just using it, whether you're paying $50 for the vaccine or $12, it didn't matter. The theory that at least I have is that somebody in the back office must have been making money. So there is a gray market in the veterinary industry that I think owners must be aware of, in that you can buy nearly expired vaccines in huge lots, hundreds, thousands of doses for pennies on the dollar.
Cheap.
Right? Consider a vaccine that's about to expire. You have 1,000 doses that's about to expire in 2 weeks. And it's sitting at some distributor's warehouse and they want to get rid of it. They'll sell it for almost nothing.
Anything. Right.
And it's legal to sell it because it's not expired yet. And so it must be, you have to go back to like, what could be possibly the motivation there. It must have been, you know, in the best explanation I can come up for it is that there would have been somebody in the back office that would be doing the procurement, the purchasing of these kind of supplies at the vet, that would somehow be able to get the difference in the price and the cost and pocket it. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. Because obviously, right, if they administered expired vaccines to thousands of dogs over this kind of long span of time, it's not just like a civil issue. It's probably a criminal issue as well.
Yes.
Because it touches on the public health.
Right.
Right? Rabies does exist in mainland US. Just some years ago, there was a person that died in Utah from rabies. And so it's a public health problem and not just, you know, a more milder type of malpractice. So based on that, right, we have to constantly, based on our experiences, alter the guidance and provide more and more concrete information to our owners, to where now, like when we have a person getting a dog from us, I send them an email that is the length of almost like a book, because I have continued to add things on that they have to watch out for and how to care and raise their puppy in a safe way. And so oftentimes I make phone calls to vets when we have a person picking up a puppy that's local to their area, to try to find just a normal vet. so that they have somebody to go to that has a possibility of that. And I still warn them, expect malpractice to be committed, but we can always nip it in the bud, right? Do not allow the vet to administer any medication without first talking to us. That's the ridiculous extent that we have to go to as a breeder in terms of protecting our dogs, our owners and their dogs. We can probably just, I think, go through some really, again, things that are going to be, I think, quite shocking. Real concrete examples of veterinary malpractice that we've observed through, some things ourselves and our owners. But what's important to keep in mind, we've never had a dog die from malpractice, either like from owned by our owners, because we're always present there to help them, even if it's by phone, to ensure that those things don't happen. But sometimes, again, owners, people are just so conditioned to trust the vet. We do have owners that have ignored our advice and took the advice of the vet or whatever prescription might have been, and it essentially always comes back to bite them, and it's completely unsurprising the result of that happening. And then we're there having to pick up the pieces, trying to, before we can even address the problem that has arisen, we have to reverse all the wrong things that have been done by the vet. So it is a very frustrating situation. I mean, this thing was shocking. And this is actually something that happened to our own dog last year. So about a 2-year-old dog, very healthy, fantastic girl, and really beautiful, correct anatomy. So what we do as breeders is we do pen hip x-rays for hips. We do, so that's for hip dysplasia, x-rays for elbow dysplasia, because those things are hereditary, right? Spine x-rays, checking the dog's heart as a puppy, patellas, some of those anatomical things. We go through that process with every single dog that could be a breeding candidate. And it's expensive, but it's very important, because that's the only way you can ensure that we continue to produce dogs that don't have hip dysplasia, right? Because it's an epidemic in most any breed here in the US. And so this girl, she started limping really out of nowhere. We hadn't taken her outside anywhere. We have a pretty big property here. And of course, this is during this coronavirus pandemic that's happening. So she's been at home and she has plenty of space, but she wouldn't have been exposed to any kind of environmental things outside her property. And so she started limping first on her left rear leg. Then she started limping further on her left front leg. So both left, and she would she started to roll her paw backward like this and not even setting it on the ground. So it was all very odd in terms of the symptoms. And we know that she didn't get injured, right? Like jumping around. Sometimes that can happen more so to like puppies. But it wasn't any of that. And so I took her to a orthopedic specialist, right? So it's orthopedic surgeons that are veterinary specialists, because it did seem to be like an anatomical issue, but we didn't know. And I spent about an hour and a half with him, like basically locked in that exam room, going back and forth, because he was categorical that the dog was limping on the rear because of a canine cruciate ligament rupture, so the ACL tear, right, in the knee, and on the front because of elbow dysplasia. So both of those things are, if they exist, it's a hereditary issue for the most part. And the issue here was that this dog has really correct, congruent anatomy, very correct biomechanics. Before she started limping, it is just very, very odd for her to have not just one of those things, but two of them at the same time. And the reason that I spent that much time going back and forth with him, and he was definitely, near the end getting quite frustrated, but I kept going at it because, I'm just very direct. I don't, I'm after truth. I don't get uncomfortable because the person is saying something and I'm unsatisfied with it, and they're a doctor that I have to just leave and listen to what they said. So I continue to ask him, and we're using the whiteboard. He's writing, drawing things, explaining things, and I'm telling him, this girl, she's got fantastic hips. We've done PEM hip X-rays. She's got very good elbows. She's got normal spine. She doesn't have any anatomical deformities. For all this to come together like this, I mean, I guess it's possible, but it's really unlikely. But what can you think of beside, right, ACL knee rupture and elbow dysplasia that could be causing these symptoms? And for the longest time, he was saying, that's it, nothing else. And then finally, near the end of the visit, because we kept going back and forth and I would just not leave, I would not let him leave, he said, well, it could be valley fever. And so I asked him, what's valley fever? He said, well, it's a fungal infection. That's neurological. So it affects the neurology of the dog. So it could result in lameness in limbs, as an example, depending on which part of the neurology the fungus has attacked and colonized. So basically, the electrical signals, right, the impulses, are not getting through to those limbs. They're being blocked by the fungal infection. But he said she's not exhibiting the typical symptoms of valley fever because she would also have cough, right? Some kind of issues with potentially breathing, because the way that you acquire a fungal infection called valley fever is through inhaling pores into your lungs. And so there's going to be a fungal infection that starts off in the lungs, and then it will move up to the neurology of the dog. And he said, so it's inconsistent with that. And I'm like, so what could be the chances of this actually being valley fever instead of elbow dysplasia and CCL rupture? He said, well, 0.5%, 1 in 200. And I'm like, okay, so let's test for it. And he tells me, I'll take your $800, but I'm telling you, it's a waste of your money. She's going to come back negative. There's no point in doing it. And I'm like, okay, so, well, I'm just going to go to our regular general practitioner vet, and they also know each other, and just get her tested there. He's like, yeah, that sounds good. And then before I leave, I get an estimate for $8,000 for surgeries. I didn't even ask for it, but it's for elbow dysplasia, basically, cutting bones and all this crazy stuff on both front left and rear left limbs of the dog, right? I immediately, actually, because we do have such a wonderful relationship with our general practitioner, I just go there without an appointment, drive immediately to her, and she makes the time to see me and the dog, and she's looking at this, and she begins to see sort of the things that we're also seeing, a little bit of an atrophy in terms of the muscular structure, muscle mass on her shoulder, on her front, left chest area. This is something that I was actually telling the specialist. I'm like, the fact that the dog is putting, folding the front paw over backward, that is not a symptom of dysplasia. It doesn't make any sense. That's not what a dysplastic dog would do. And she said the same thing to me, our general practitioner. And I told her where I had just come from, and he said it could be valley fever, but he said it's like 1 in 200 chance, 0.5%. And he says, well, this actually looks really potentially neurological to me. And we do the valley fever test. Sure enough, positive. Fungal infection, right? It's a mystery as to how she acquired it here on our property. No other dog has acquired it. It's not contagious between dogs, thankfully, right? You have to inhale those spores from like some kind of either moist ground or actually dry soil, I think. So it's a valley fever that it's common in the Southwest US, like desert areas, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, New Mexico. And so, of course, we immediately put her on antifungal medication. And within a span of, she started improving almost immediately. Her muscle mass on her chest and shoulder recovered completely in about a month to a month and a half. Her limping completely disappeared, right? And again, if you don't have this constant level of alertness and doubt, right? You want to question everything you're being told, even though these are medical professionals. Because if something doesn't make sense, if there's a better explanation for it, you want to, again, go through the cornerstone of medicine, the diagnostic method. How does the diagnostic method work? You start with the potential causes of given symptoms that are going to be the most likely, that are going to be potentially the least invasive to check for, right? And then you go down the list until you find what it is. So the scary part with this kind of situation is that I'm pretty sure, right? If I had gone along with doing that $8,000 surgery for elbow dysplasia and canine cruciate ligament rupture on this poor dog, it's very unlikely that the vet would open up that dog and then terminate the surgery and come back to me and say, actually, she doesn't have elbow dysplasia, it doesn't have a canine cruciate ligament rupture, sorry, and close her back up. He would go through with the surgery. And the dog would still have valley fever. Right? So it's and this is the kind of stuff that happens to us. We have enough experience to catch these things, but regular owners, they're at such a disadvantage with regards to really every aspect of caring for a dog in the US, because of that implicit trust that the society sort of forces you to have culturally. Another huge issue, and again, this is something that I would just straight up put in the category of veterinary malpractice. Maybe it's a little controversial with some, but anybody that's listening needs to understand what the global perspective, when you consider the approach of other countries, is with regards to the spaying and neutering, right? So I'll just use the term sterilization. It's to sterilize is both spaying and neutering. Doesn't matter the gender. So when you are sterilizing a dog, and again, if we just backtrack a little bit, United States, to some extent Canada, and the United Kingdom, these three English-speaking countries, is where it is culturally normal to remove surgically the sex organs of a dog without any pre-existing condition necessitating that surgery, right? So it's done as a matter of course. You get a puppy, you do the vaccinations, and then you spay and neuter, right? It's the norm here. Not everybody does it, but I think it's probably most, I would guess, well over 50% of dogs in the US are probably spayed or neutered. You can contrast that actually to one country that's like the extreme to the opposite, which is actually, I think it's going to be very insightful for our listeners. Norway, it's really, I think societally one of the most developed countries in the world, right? The Northern Europeans, they really have their things together, whether it's education, just you know, how their society functions. It's a very balanced, rational approach to things. In Norway, it is against federal law to spay or neuter a dog that is healthy. So you don't even have that option. The only time that a dog can be spayed or neutered if it has pre-existing health problem that would be alleviated by this surgery, right? So for example, if a dog acquires testicular cancer, neuter the dog. In the case of a female, right, it's rare. All of these things are really rare, but they can happen where the correct thing to do is surgically remove the sex organ. So in the case of a female dog, it could be pyometra, especially like a closed pyometra. It's a bacterial infection of the uterus that, not in all cases whatsoever, but in some instances, it could be completely incurable. It would be chronic, and the dog could potentially die, like if you don't do anything for weeks, right? But if it is going to be concretely diagnosed as a type of pyometra where like the antibiotic regimen didn't work, it just came back and it keeps coming back and the dog is suffering, and then you just remove the uterus and that problem is solved. No more pyometra. Without those kind of issues, in Norway, you're not allowed to spay or neuter the dog, which I think is a fantastic approach. Most other countries, right, whether you look at European countries or like Russia, the approach is just, even though they don't have a law prohibiting that, everybody's dog is intact, right? And there is no issue there. You don't see these dogs falling over and dying left and right because they're intact, or having some kind of health problems because they're intact. That is a made up sort of myth. And I think culturally here in the US, Bob Barker, as I've learned, has done so much damage because, you know, his sign off, as I understand, I didn't grow up in the US, but from his game show, his sign off was always, you know, spay or neuter your dogs if you love them, something crazy like that. The problem with removing an organism's sex organs is that you're actually removing the ability for that dog to produce the sex hormones in a balanced way. So things like testosterone, estrogen, the androgens, there's a bunch of sex hormones, regardless of the gender, that are produced by the ovaries and the testicles. When those hormones, they play a crucial role in essentially every single process in the canine organism. So it's not just for reproduction purposes, right? The consequences are very vast, but so one category is anatomical. In the case of at least American bulldogs, the largest bones in the body, which are the femur and the tibia, so they comprise the rear leg of the dog, they stop growing permanently. So they close at about 2.5 to 3 years of age. The process by which every bone in your body closes, like once it's the same thing with humans, right? It's a hormonal signal that gets sent. It's those sex hormones that tell those bones to close and stop growing forever. So when a dog is spayed or neutered prior to that kind of an age, prior to about 3 years old in case of a large breed, what happens is that the body cannot even send that signal correctly to the bone. So the bone continues to grow longer and just bigger. And you're talking about the biggest bones in the body. So there's actually a study. It's also, we cite all this stuff on our website too, but the study, they compared the test group where dogs that were sterilized and the control group where dogs that were intact forever. The group that was sterilized, it was two groups that are very similar dogs, statistically just a little taller. I was sharing this story with an owner of ours who also is involved in horses, and she was completely unsurprised by this. She said, actually, I know that because there's some kind of a niche thing within the horse industry where they intentionally castrate the horse very early so that it would grow taller and bigger. So it's actually done intentionally in horses. So with regards to dogs, right, even if it's something minuscule, like a 1/16 of an inch or a 1/32 of an inch, taller bone, longer bone, you're talking about the hips, you're talking about the knees there, right? It will make the biomechanics, the way the dog actually moves, the locomotion of the dog, incongruent, because you have the genetically programmed size of everything in the dog, like all the soft tissue, supportive tissue around the bones, around the joints, and then you happen to have a femur and a tibia that's like longer and wider or slightly bigger. The kind of stresses that the joints are going to experience as a result of that artificial manipulation of the size of the bone through sterilization are going to cause injuries, anatomical injuries, and degeneration of those joints. So dogs that are sterilized are significantly more prone to even hip dysplasia, interestingly enough. But one of the big things is actually canine cruciate ligament ruptures, the knee ACL rupture. The risk of that, and there's research on all this, it skyrockets in dogs that are sterilized. Another study was done, but almost 500 female Rottweilers. So the control group were intact forever, and this was a study that the researchers waited until all the dogs lived their entire lives and passed away, and then drew their conclusions. The control group were intact forever, and the test group included Rottweiler females that were sterilized even at up to 4 years of age, so into full mature adulthood. And their conclusion was the test group lived 30% less in terms of lifespan. So that's a difference between 10 years and 13 years, 12 years and 15 years. That is a huge difference. And it sounds like that study, they couldn't even track of the actual, the causes, because it would have been everything, right? Could be anything from cancer to other immune problems. Maybe this is a good time to discuss cancer a little bit. So cancer so cancerous cells can appear upon replication, as they do in humans. This happens in especially mammals. And to define what a cancerous cell is a little bit. So when a cell replicates, say it's a skin cell, when it replicates and divides into two cells, the DNA is supposed to get copied one to one. So it's supposed to be completely identical. It's supposed to be your DNA. But sometimes there is just a typo, basically, right? It's a misfire that DNA gets copied slightly incorrectly. So, and the cell becomes a cancerous cell when the DNA that was copied incorrectly has to do with instructions for the replication and the lifespan of that cell for the most part. So each cell in your body has the DNA instructions within it that tells it how long it's supposed to live. So it could be a cell that only has to live, should live for, say, 30 days. After 30 days, if that's the instruction for that type of cell in your body, it's supposed to kill itself, implode. There's DNA code instruction in that every cell you have of how often it is supposed to replicate itself. So it could be something like replicate every 2 weeks or replicate every month, whatever that code, that instruction may be. If there's a typo in the DNA instructions for replication frequency, it could be now that the cell is copying the wrong DNA code to replicate itself every 10 hours. And then in 10 hours, you have another cell with that same identical code that says replicate yourself for another 10 hours, right? So cancerous cells, they appear, like even in humans, I think it's almost on a daily basis. We have cancerous cells that appear as a result of that incorrect replication, that typo in the code. But it is the immune system. Well, it always goes back to the immune system. It's our immune system that actually has a way to deal with it. If you have a functioning, healthy, normal immune system, it's always on the lookout for cancer cells, and it has antibodies that will zap that cell before it hopefully even has a chance to replicate itself once. But that process of cancer cells appearing in your body, it's a consistent, frequent thing, regardless of the type of animal that you are. It never grows into like a tumor or cancer because your immune system is there protecting yourself. So understand that when the immune system is what we are damaging repeatedly through various types of malpractice, including actually spaying and neutering. So these sex hormones, they play a very crucial role in the proper development and modulation of the immune system function as well. Even forgetting things like steroids or Apoquel, right? So all these things, they're piled onto your dog to where you can really take it all back to, the crap dog food is going to suppress the immune system. The potentially over vaccination, like we have a situation with a dog that was vaccinated 7 times as a puppy because they didn't read the fact that in the medical record, the puppy was already vaccinated prior to it, right? And the owners didn't notice. So all those things, they pile on to further and further and further suppress the immune system where like the poor puppy doesn't even have a chance to develop normally. And so then it can, actually present itself as cancer at 3 years old or cancer at 4 years old. I mean, typically, we would have always thought, my wife's point of view on this has been, that's got to be a hereditary type of cancer. But that's also back with her experience of veterinary care in other civilized countries where it's done very differently. You're not giving your dog Apoquel and steroids and antibiotics all the time. It just isn't really done that way in other countries. So here, there's always going to be a certain genetic predisposition potentially if your dog dies of cancer at 3 years old, but these things surely don't help. With regards to other types of, well, Scott, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear another vaccine story? Or do you want to hear a veterinarian suggesting the owners kill their dog?
Well, let's go with that, and let's we're getting close to our wrap time, so I definitely would like to have you back in a couple of weeks if you're willing. Well, go ahead with what you're saying.
So let's do. So this is a story that is absolutely shocking. So this was a few months back. I got a call from a lady from Colorado And she doesn't have a dog from us, but she did have an American Bulldog that was 6 years old, and she was literally crying. And she called me because she found our website where, we talk a lot about veterinary malpractice and how to properly raise a dog and what things to watch out for. So that's how she found us. And she told me that she just wants to understand what happened with the dog that she had that was fully healthy, that was now dead. And so she had told me that, and this all happened within the span of a week, right? So she said her completely healthy 6-year-old American Bulldog male all of a sudden stopped being able to urinate. So she said he would lift his leg up, try to pee, and would look at her from far away with a worrying expression because he couldn't pee. So she immediately took him to the vet. And it was just a regular general practitioner vet. And she was given something like amoxicillin, right? Like one of the most common generic wide spectrum antibiotics, and sent home. So they didn't even extract the urine that was collecting in the bladder. And she went home, and that night, the dog was struggling throughout the night because his bladder was getting filled up with the urine that he couldn't excrete. Obviously, the antibiotic didn't do anything. She went back to that same first vet before they opened in the morning, saying that this is not helping. I need help. The vet didn't want to do anything, sent them to a emergency, like a specialty center that was, I think, something like an hour and a half, 2.5 hours away. And she got there, and at least they did do, it sounds like, some diagnostic work. So they checked his blood. They excluded basically, a typical infection. They excluded any kind of prostate issues, bladder infection. So they couldn't find anything wrong with the dog to explain why he's not able to urinate. And then this is when it starts going again really weird. They do an exploratory surgery, basically, from the sound of it. So they put him under anesthesia, and they open him up, and then they close him up without really doing anything because there was nothing to see. And they tell the owner they cleaned his bladder, right? I mean, there's nothing to clean. At least, the dog had, while he was hospitalized, he had a catheter through his penis so that the urine would just flow out. So if you have a catheter in there, the urine is coming out.
Right.
So the dog is fine, right? Yeah. So then she after 2 or 3 days, she got the dog back, went home. The issue wasn't resolved, obviously, because they didn't do anything. So they just told her what it wasn't, but didn't tell her what it was, and discharged the dog. And then she went to a third vet. Again, there was no help. And the fourth vet, finally, she went to the fourth vet. So the third vet also didn't extract the urine from the bladder. And the dog is struggling and struggling. It's possible, now, like, it's been a few days, again, that the dog hasn't been able to pee.
Yeah.
And so the fourth vet, she takes the poor dog there, and they tell her that the dog is suffering so much that she should put the dog down. And again, this goes back to, that kind of, conditioning of relying on vets and medical professionals and blindly trusting them. She agrees, and they put down the dog. And the vet doesn't even offer a necropsy. So that's like an animal autopsy. The vet actually immediately gets the body cremated.
Oh.
Right. So there's nothing you can do at that point. Like she will never find out what happened to the dog. And there she is calling me after this had just transpired in the previous week, asking me to try to make sense of it all. And, it is obviously like a very shocking situation, but at the same time, it's not surprising to me, because there are things that are, it's just the way that these vets do things. It's just so common. And I can only theorize as to what happened. And the tragedy of it all, right, is that that dog had absolutely no reason to die, because the problem is the vets couldn't figure out what was causing the dog's inability to urinate. But it's not an emergency so long as the dog has a catheter in through his penis.
Right.
You have all the time, you have weeks, months, years to diagnose the cause of this.
Right.
Worst case scenario, right? Stick a syringe into his bladder from the outside and suck the urine out. The dog is going to be okay temporarily. Right. And you just keep doing that, or like, yeah, catheter, you got the catheter, right? The vets couldn't even do that.
Right.
And from the sound of it, from the symptoms that she was describing, I've never seen this dog. I've only, heard of what she told me. But to me, the most plausible cause is actually neurological. Because she said the dog was otherwise completely healthy, right? If it was cancer, there would likely be other symptoms too.
Right.
But here, it was just such a weird situation where the dog is simply unable to open its bladder, right? So it's like a physical ability to open the bladder so the urine can come out. That is controlled by certain muscles. They have to contract and expand to do that. And it goes back to the fact that there are these different things, like it took me an hour and a half to extract that remote possibility with the specialist with regards to the valley fever, which was a neurological infection, right? It could have easily been something like that, where, because it can be completely random as to what it can affect in your motor control over the body. So the neurological signal just gets blocked by that infection. And in that instance, it would be something that's completely reversible.
Right. That's yeah. I mean, once you get the urine flowing, there's no rush. It's not a medical emergency anymore.
Yeah.
For sure. I think this has been definitely one of the best podcasts we've done, perhaps the best, most informative. And I can't thank you enough for being here. We're going to invite you back in 2 weeks if you're able. I'll get with you on the scheduling. And we had a number of questions tonight that unfortunately we couldn't get to, but we will definitely get to them the next time. And so what are your final thoughts?
In terms of final thoughts, as a dog owner in America, one must be very skeptical and cautious. And when it comes to dealing with veterinarians, and understand that most of the malpractice is not something that is going to just kill your dog right there on the spot. Most of malpractice is never caught onto by the owner. They never realize it's happening.
Yeah.
And it is really common. So the vast majority of vets that we've had some kind of encounters through our owners or ourselves, regardless of geography in the US, it is their MO. That is how they conduct themselves. Good vets, they exist. There are some fantastic vets too.
Right.
Really, really rare. And so we can, go over some things in terms of how we specifically try to find the right type of vet for our owners. Maybe we can do that on the next show. I mean, we've literally only covered probably 1/10 of the agenda that I had.
I know you can.
So there's plenty of material that we can do this and turn it into a little bit of a series.
If you're willing to come back, you're welcome back as often as you'd like, because I know the response I'm going to get from my group, and they're going to want you back tomorrow. But we'll contact you. I'll talk to you probably next couple of days, and we'll try to set something up for 2 weeks from tonight, if you're available, of course.
Yeah, so definitely, I'm very happy to help. This is something that Olga and I, my wife and I, we're really passionate about this. It's just devastating to see these things happen, and we want to make sure that we can help as much as we can.
Appreciate that. Colleen, do you have any thoughts for Igor?
Yeah, I mean, just thank you and your wife both for all you do preventative. I mean, you have people who help support with after the malpractice, which is unfortunate, but all that you do, you know, to help people going into those situations is much needed. And yeah, your insights are incredible. So definitely, if people have any more questions, you can email me. I'll put it in the chat right in Zoom. Feel free to drop it now, but you've just been such an incredible resource, and we so appreciate you being here.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
Igor.
so much, Colleen. Thank you, Scott.
I'll
Have
talk
a
to you
nice
next.
evening.
I'll talk to you next day or so.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I know you've found this to be highly educational. It's part of what we do at Joey's Legacy. We want you to be as educated and informed as possible, so you can be the best animal advocates you can be for your loved ones. All right. You all have a good night. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Igor.
Bye.
Bye-bye.